Now, I'm absolutely fascinated by this subject. It's one I've wanted to look into, but haven't particularly. But I know you've done quite a bit on it. So would you like to just tell us how you're going to tackle the subject this evening?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So, yeah, good evening, everyone, and I hope the topic tonight is of interest. I think we've certainly seen we've posted this online, and it's certainly generated a lot of interesting questions. So, if you've joined us tonight for the first time, you're very welcome. So, the way we thought we might approach tonight is just in three big blocks. So, we're going to firstly think about the question that's the sort of title of tonight's session. Then we'll go into a section thinking about the evidence around this topic, I suppose, and then we'll think sort of to the so what does this all mean? So on the first bit of introducing the question, then I'll pause then, Andrew, and perhaps you can just check and challenge that are making some form of sense. The question we've got tonight to thumb through, and I think for those of you who have come to some of our webinars before, this is part of a wider series where we're asking something like questions for life or something like that. So the title for tonight's one is, does Christianity have an influence on the way we all think today? But I think it's probably useful to just summarize what we're trying to get at tonight. So the first bit is what do we mean by various terms in the question, or at least how have I tried to understand this question and reflect on it? So the first one is about Christianity. What do we mean by Christianity here in this specific instance? And actually, we're talking in a relatively broad sense about Christianity tonight, rather than any kind of specific strand of Christianity. We're talking in the sort of broadest sense. If you've ever read something like C.S. Lewis, what he talks about is sort of mere Christianity, sort of the broad sweep of Christianity over time. And then when we're talking about we in this particular instance, I am actually being slightly precise here in the way I've answered the question. And we can for sure think about what that might mean more widely later. But particularly, I'm talking about those individuals who live in the West, what I guess historically used to be called Christendom, but people in the UK or mainland Europe or US or places like Australia and New Zealand, that kind of place. So that's what I'm really sort of focusing on there. And then when I'm talking about thinking, I'm not really talking about here what you have for breakfast, that kind of thinking. I'm talking more deeply, perhaps about some of the more foundational things about the way we think. So that's the question that we're going to answer. But I'm very conscious that with this sort of topic, it's useful to, I guess, explain where we've got information from. So I've just done a couple of minutes on where I've got a lot of the information for the middle part of the book, middle part of this evening session from. And then perhaps Andrew will pause there and you can just check that we're all on track. So as Andrew kind of alluded to earlier, I'm a member of the Watford Christadelphian Church. I don't have any specialist knowledge on this particular topic at all. So in my job, it's absolutely nothing to do with this topic. It's in the automotive sector as it happens. And the degree I did is, again, absolutely nothing to do with this topic. So I don't really bring anything to bear personally on this particular issue. So I'm really using some other material as sort of source material for this this topic tonight. So there's actually three books that I've used as sort of reference material for what we'll cover tonight. And I'll briefly just talk to these for a few seconds. So there's the three books you can see on the screen. You've probably seen, at least in bookshelves or when you're going to the train station, the one in the middle. It's a very, very well-read book. It's sold millions of copies. It's called Sapiens. It's by a Jewish guy. Then there's two books that were published more recently. That one was published about 9 years ago. And then there's two other books. The one on the right is a book published last year, and it's about a history of the Western world. And it's written by a historian called Tom Holland. And then the third is an interesting book that I came across only a couple of weeks ago, which is called The Weirdest People in the World. And it's a book particularly about the West. And I guess the reason for referencing this is I think it's important that we show our workings as you would at school. And just kind of to illustrate that I'm trying not here to sort of cherry pick evidence, I suppose. These three books are all written by people who are real experts in their field. They come from quite different backgrounds. So one's English, one's American, one's Israeli. I think it's fair to say that all three of them would have no sort of bias toward the Christian faith. I think that's probably fair to say. In fact, I don't even know the religious affiliation of two of the authors. If I was to guess, I would guess that they were atheist or agnostic, but I don't know for sure. So I guess what I'm hoping that we can cover in the evidence section is the reflections of these people who are very sort of specialists in their field in this area around history and culture. And it's not just sort of my sort of wild whims on a random Wednesday night. I think it is fair to say that obviously Christian writers and Christian historians have made the same points as that we'll cover tonight, but I've tried not to use those just to bolster the argument, just so that you can see it's not something that's just pushed by Christian historians. Andrew, did that make any sense? Anything you wanted to check at this particular point?
Thank you, John. It looks fascinating to me. I should say I've read several of Tom Holland's books, but not this one. He's mainly a historian of the ancient world, and very, very accessible one. He's quite a scholar, but he's also, if you've never read his books, I recommend them to anyone.
Yeah.
I just think it's worth pausing at this stage to say to everyone who's online, thank you for coming online. I hope you've got a general idea of how it's going to go this evening. I'm going to push you later, John, to say, yeah, but what's the point of all of this then? But I suspect you need to develop your theme a bit first. Please, if you are watching online, please use the what's it called, the chat on YouTube. Ask your questions, make points if you want. If there's time towards the end, because we'll aim to finish, all being well, around 9 o'clock UK time. If there are a few minutes at the end, John, we can perhaps have a go at answering some of the questions that have been put up while you're going along. Sure. That's all I wanted to say to lead into what I hope will now be you unpacking some of the evidence that you've discovered. Over to you, John.
Great, okay. So, and I will probably move through this reasonably quickly. And if I'm going too fast, Andrew, just slow me down, or if there's people watching online, just tell me to slow down. But some of this unconscious isn't sort of everyone's cup of tea. But I think it's just worth marshalling the evidence reasonably quickly just to illustrate the point around this question. So the question, if you remember, is what influence does Christianity have on the way that we think today? Is there an influence, and what extent does it exist? So let's think of some real obvious stuff to start with. And there's a few examples that you'll see on the screen that are, I suppose, a way in which Christianity still has a sort of legacy influence in the UK today. And I've taken the UK as a proxy for the Western world. Let's give a few examples. So one is schooling. So I was sort of trying to get the statistics on this just to show sort of the proportion of schooling that's sort of faith schools. So actually in the UK at the moment, or at least in last year, I think the data was from a paper that was pulled together for the House of Commons, about a third of state schools across primary and secondary education are Christian. Most of them are Church of England, but a reasonable proportion are Catholic, and then other sort of Christian denominations. So on some level, that is an influence that happens across the UK. So that's one influence, I suppose, on a really, really simple level. Another that's slightly different angle is around the calendar we use. So most people in the West use the Gregorian calendar, which was introduced by one of the popes, as it happens, many hundreds of years ago. Another influence that you might say, well, it's not really that important. It's probably not that important, but it is an influence that we do see in the world today. And then I guess another really obvious one, and who knows whether we'll be able to even see each other at Christmas this year, but we do have a lot of public holidays in the UK that are linked to various religious events. So Easter and Christmas are probably the two most obvious examples of that in the UK. So I will not dwell on that for any length of time. It's just to illustrate that, of course, there are legacy influences of Christianity on UK society today. Point number one. But that's not really proving that much. It's just saying that there's a sort of legacy influence. That doesn't necessarily impact the way that we think, I suppose. I suppose it does in the way that we think about maybe dates and times and stuff, but it's not that fundamental. So I wanted to think a little bit wider, then we'll think a little bit deeper. So when we think a little bit wider, we're going to think again of three specific areas. And I'm actually going to dwell on the first one, mainly because I found it really, really interesting. So, and that is the influence that the concept of marriage has had on society. Now, do bear with me here, because you might think, oh, what is he going to talk about here? And believe me, when you've seen the next slide, you really will wonder what I'm rattling on about. But the argument that's made in two of the books that I referenced, particularly in the one that was published this year, is about the powerful and transformative effect that the concept of Christian monogamy has had on Western society. Monogamy meaning the concept of being married, one man and one woman for life. Now, before we move into that and understand the impact it's had, I want to show you a particularly interesting chart, or at least it's interesting to someone like me. So this is a study that was done in 2005 and has been replicated at various places around the world about the testosterone level of men, where they traced it for the same men over a period of time to see what impact life events had on their testosterone level. Now, you'll probably be aware, and if there's anyone who actually knows about testosterone, I apologize for butchering this particular content, but you'll probably know that testosterone levels decrease over time as men age. However, there's a very interesting dynamic about the speed at which testosterone levels drop. And so this particular study looked at individuals, men in this instance, and compared their testosterone levels over 4 years to see what the drop was like. And they had a look across men who were unmarried, men who were married with no children, and men who were married with children. I hope this is all making sense. And the broad point to note is a pretty simple one, that if you were married, your testosterone level dropped more than if you were still unmarried. And if you were married with children, it really did drop off to an extent of, as you can see on the chart, over 50%. So you might be thinking, what on earth has this got to do with society? Well, the reason that's interesting, as the author of the book kind of points out, is that actually that has a fairly profound impact on society. Because if you're in a society where you have lots of married men, and particularly married men with children, in the cohort as a whole, you have less testosterone, and testosterone has often been linked, or is linked to all sorts of things, as you'll see in a second. So what we've learned from this and many other studies is that if you are married with children, you have less testosterone, and that means you're less likely to, for example, commit crime or be highly aggressive and that kind of thing. So how does this all fit with Christianity? Well, I guess one key factor that the Christian sort of principle encouraged was this principle of monogamy. There's one man, one woman for life. And over time, Christians as a whole favored that model, and it was encouraged in the sort of church community. And at the same time, they were discouraged from seeking sex outside marriage, for example. And to make that harder, if you will, particularly when the church developed, they looked to try and find a way to reduce the amount of prostitutes, and particularly tried to minimize sexual slavery, for example. So they controlled both through the principle of monogamy, but also tried to reduce the options for you to find sex outside marriage. And the other big thing they did was, since the time of Jesus made some very strong teachings about the principles of divorce, again, which meant that you couldn't go from one wife to another, which obviously most famously one of our kings tried his best to change, and hence came the Church of England. So I think that's an important point, because actually that does contrast fairly dramatically with other societies that existed before Christianity came into existence, and even societies where monogamy was encouraged, like Athens or pre-Christian Rome, where there was this principle of monogamy at play, but men weren't kind of strongly constrained to adhere to that, and there was actually many other routes for them to find sex outside marriage through cult prostitutes or whatever it might be. So what that meant, and I hope you're still with me here, is actually that in societies where you had a lot of people being married to just one person and them being married and having children, it reduced the testosterone level in the society as a whole. So you can see here on the quote on the slide, numerous studies support the view that getting married in monogamous society reduces a man's likelihood of both committing crimes and of using alcohol or drugs. And it goes on to make the point that in many other societies where men married multiple wives, and it normally was that way around rather than the other way around, what that ended up meaning is that the sort of rich, powerful, strong men had lots of wives. You had a lot of men, as they've called here the math problem, with a lot of low status men, many of whom who don't marry, or have children have these higher testosterone levels. And what those people ended up doing, as it evidences here, they were at increased risk of criminal behavior and other social ills over their entire lives. So actually, the principle of monogamy provided a kind of stabilizing force on society, where in polygamous societies, they didn't have that, and they would have this sort of corrosive influence of lots and lots of men without partners and without children. So that is, I think, very interesting when you think about the influence of society on society even today. And then just one other quote on this one before I move on to another principle. This quote actually comes from another historian, and he talks about that one of the most powerful things that Christianity encouraged in society was that the same rules applied to the rich and the poor, to the king, to the sort of peasant, as he's put it here in his hovel. And it says at the end here, poor men's chance of gaining a wife and producing progeny or children were enhanced. It is very likely that the fairer distribution of women across society helped reduce abductions and rapes and levels of violence generally in the early Middle Ages. That is a really profound impact that the principle of from Christianity about monogamy in this instance had on society. And that's just one of many, many examples, but I've teased that one out just because I think it was, I mean, those of you know me will know I wanted a chart in there, but that is quite interesting in topic. And then just two other ones briefly that I think are worth mentioning. So these are other kind of broad impacts that Christianity has brought to society or had on society. The second is around letters and learning. So there's lots that can be said here, but actually, particularly in the last 2,000 years, Christian scribes particularly are very sort of useful in the sense that they've kept much of the texts of the ancient world. They were the ones who copied them down through time. The concept of a book, so this sort of way we view a book as we would today, is sort of built out of this principle of a codex, which happened in the sort of couple of centuries after when Jesus lived. And many historians would attribute that to being one of the inventions, if you like, that came about because Christians wanted to transmit their content through books. And then things like universities and schools in the first instance were all set up under sort of Christian communities. And then one other one that I think is probably, again, very obvious, and actually is something that, to be fair, many religious communities around the world were the first to set up, was the concept of care for the sick and the poor, the principles of social justice or charity. And I think if you do read historians on this, they do talk about this principle that the concept of charity and charitable giving outside of the kind of Jewish Christian world is a very sort of alien concept at the time of the Lord Jesus. And hospitals, many of which were founded on Christian principles. So these are all legacy impacts that have come through Christianity. Now, I'll go on in a second to say that this doesn't prove that Christianity is true. It doesn't prove that Christianity is better than other religions. In fact, on some of these things, particularly in the example of care, if you look in Eastern religions, again, we see some similarities in those religious worldviews. But I guess what I'm trying to just sketch out is the sort of tentacles of Christianity that even sort of exist to today. So just before we think about sort of some of the drawbacks perhaps that Christianity has brought society, just let's think a little bit deeper about two other sort of foundational things that are deeply embedded in the Western mindset, the Western psyche, are like sort of legacy impacts of the Christian worldview, sort of values that Christians hold dear. So the first is the principle of the sanctity of life, the idea that life is important. Every person has a value. And this is something that you might think is just kind of obvious, but many people in the ancient world certainly didn't view things that way. I mean, I've got a quote here from Aristotle, one of the famous Greek philosophers, and he is quoted as saying, or he wrote, "Let there be a law that no deformed child live." And I'm not necessarily suggesting that everyone in the ancient world thought that, but I think it's fair to say that the kind of principle of the sanctity of life was not something that the ancient world would have really recognized in the same way that we do today. And actually, it's fair to say that many kind of these historians actually observe this in the way that they talk. So there's a few kind of wordy bits in these quotes, but I hope the kind of illustration illustrates, sort of highlights this. So in this part of Sapiens, the author here is talking about the different ways in which various mindsets or philosophies or worldviews exist and why they exist. And so he's talking about a principle called humanism, which sort of elevates the principle of humanity above other sort of animals. And in this, what the writer actually says is, even though liberal humanism sanctifies humans, makes them special, it does not deny the existence of God and is in fact founded on monotheist beliefs of people who believe in one God, so Jews and Christians, and to some extent Islam. Without recourse to a creator God, it becomes embarrassingly difficult for liberals to explain what is so special about individual sapiens. And the point he's making there is actually one of the sort of core tenets of the principle of humanism is that humans are special. But his point is, well, where does that principle that humans are special come from, or indeed more special than the animal kingdom, for example? And his point is that comes from the principle of a creator God, and this principle that we see at the start of Genesis, that God made humans in the image of God. So that's a really sort of important foundational principle that most people in the West accept, that life is important, it's precious for every human. That is something that comes from a Christian or Jewish Christian worldview. And he goes on to then talk about a slightly different strand of humanism. And he actually says again that that type of humanism, called social humanism, is also built on monotheist foundations. The idea that all humans are equal is a revamped version of the monotheist conviction that all souls are equal before God. So he makes a similar point, that this kind of a concept of equality, that humans are equal across different races and things like that, is something that actually, again, has its roots in, as he calls it, monotheist foundations, Judeo-Christianity. And this point, just in case you think it's just one of these authors, Tom Holland makes exactly the same point in his book called Dominion, and I won't read all of the quote there, but the first bit's important. Without the biblical story that God had created humanity in his own image to draw upon, the reverence of humanists for their own species risks seeming mawkish and shallow. He's saying, where does that principle that humanity is important actually come from, if it doesn't come from the biblical story around God creating humanity? He goes on and explains that principle comes from the Bible, that humans are made in the image of God, and that Jesus died for everyone. There's no Jew, Greek, slave nor free, male or female. And for those of you who know your sort of biblical text well, you'll realize that Tom Holland's actually quoting there from a passage that Paul wrote in Galatians. So I think this is important because it does present a very valid question. And one of the intents of doing these webinars is to raise questions both that we think are hard for Christianity to answer, but also for other worldviews to answer. And this point is well made, just before I go on to the second of those big foundations, by a guy by the name of Douglas Murray. And he talks about the fact that these principles of the sanctity of human life do come from, as he puts it, Judeo-Christian civilization, the worldview. And he goes on to make a point that actually, if you are someone who doesn't follow that particular faith, you've got to decide where that principle comes from. And he points out at the back end of this quote that actually it's really, really hard to find a foundation stone to believe that that's important from somewhere else other than the sort of principles that come out of Judeo-Christianity. So that we've just briefly summarized is this principle of the sanctity of life, that because God in the biblical text is said to value humanity and to value people equally, and Jesus died for all people, those principles are really something that underpins some parts of liberal humanism and other things. Andrew, I've just seen you come on. Was that because you wanted me to clarify something?
Can I ask a question? Maybe you're going to answer this later, so forgive me if I'm jumping ahead. But you pointed out that the idea of the sanctity of human life, the idea of the equality of human beings, say of different races, is something that came from Judeo-Christian tradition, and yet you don't have to look very far to see that sometimes some Christians have been saying that people with a different colour skin are less human than people with a white skin. Are you going to come onto that later on?
I probably won't actually, but I think that's an extremely good point here. That actually, what I guess we're talking about here is the sort of principles around Christianity, the core kind of tenets of Christianity. That's not to say that Christians have always lived by those standards, or indeed the standards of Jesus. And we will go on in a second to talk about some of the horrors done in the name of Christianity. So obviously racism in the current context, I guess, Andrew, is probably what you're referring to. But there are also many, many other sort of sort of stains on the copybook of Christianity over the eras that I would say is not consistent with the principles of Christianity, but Christians have done. Is that fair, do you think?
That's great. And I just remind people, if you've got questions, stick them in the chat. But John, please carry on. Thanks very much.
Yeah, cool. So no, that is a very helpful point. I will talk about some of the sort of negative impacts of Christianity in a second, more widely. So I guess the other thing that I think is probably worth highlighting is the sort of impact that the moral compass of Christianity, the principles around good and evil, are still sort of felt in the world today in the way that we think about the world. So let me just give you a couple of examples that are really interesting that Tom Holland at the end of his book talks about. So he's talking about the fact that that the moral code of Christianity sort of has almost outlived the amount of people that actually still follow Jesus personally. And he talks about here about Europe, which is obviously a continent that probably has the highest rate of agnosticism and atheism in the world. And it says here, even in Europe, a continent with churches far emptier than those in the United States, the trace elements of Christianity continue to infuse people's morals and presumptions so utterly that many failed even to detect their presence. Like dust, he's a bit poetic, old Holland, but he's a nice writer. Like dust particles so fine as to be invisible to the naked eye, they were breathed in equally by everyone, believers, atheists, and those who had never paused so much as to think about religion. Had it been otherwise, then no one would ever have got woke. And what woke means in that particular context is the idea that you'd look out for social justice, you'd look for inequality in the world. But his point is that the foundations behind why you might think some of those principles are because you value the human life, because you value equality. And his argument is that the roots, the tentacles of that they come from this sort of Christian worldview. And he does actually go on, and I think we've got another quote in a second that will illustrate this. That actually, if you take a very sort of if you remove God from the equation, it's very hard to find a reason why humanity is different. And this was a conclusion that actually in Nazi Germany they had come to. So this quote at the top is actually from one of sort of Hitler's right-hand men, a guy called Himmler. And he said, there is nothing particular about man. There's nothing special about humankind. He is but a part of the world. And Holland goes on in this quote to kind of highlight, well, actually, that is hard to sort of take to the sort of furthest extent of what that means, because Nazis did, and most people wouldn't go anywhere near that today. And his point here, which is highlighted on, yet the implications of this view, which the Nazis, of course, claimed as their sanction for genocide, remain unsettling for many. Just as a particular philosopher had foretold, free thinkers who mock the idea of a god as a dead thing, a sky fairy, an imaginary friend, still hold to taboos and morals that derive from Christianity. So this is a sort of second of those pillars that actually, even within our kind of core psyche, the values around life and some of the moral compasses that we value, to take away things like why we really appreciate sort of self-sacrifice, for example, has real roots in the nature of God and Jesus that still infuses today, or the idea that to be low, to be humble is a good thing. In the ancient world, that was a crazy thing to do. And yet in Jesus, the sort of Christian faith really highlighted the power of weakness, that there's strength in weakness. And some historians have kind of highlighted that even in Western psyche, how you kind of root for the underdog might have its sort of underpinnings in this idea. So there's some really deep tentacles that we, maybe if we're thinking about this for the first time, you might want to think, why do I think that humans are special? Why do I think that humans are equal all over the world? What's the foundation stone behind why that exists? And why are we different to, say, other parts of the natural world? That's a valid question, I think, to ask and to thumb through. But just lastly in this section, I think it is worth saying, and Andrew alluded to this earlier about racism, for example, in all over the world. Bad things have, of course, happened in the name of Christianity. This picture here is a painting by a guy called Frédéric Chopin. I don't know how you pronounce his name. And this is a picture of the first crusade that happened in sort of the Middle Ages, where Christians went around, particularly in this instance, I think it was the Catholic Church led this. They went around killing people in no uncertain terms. And it was a sort of brutal period of history, but violence was done by followers of Jesus who believed that they were following him. Now, I'd charge that they weren't following his spirit, but they did it in the name of Christianity. So that's definitely something that has been done in the name of Christianity that I think we can all agree is a terrible thing. Another example, and there are others, and Andrew referred to racism earlier, is the principle of slavery. Now, it's fair to say that down through the last 2,000 years, Christians have argued heavily against slavery based on those principles around the sanctity of life and the equality of people at various points. But equally, in the 1900s, there were Christians on the other side of the argument, making arguments from the biblical text, arguing that they thought slavery should be maintained. Now, that doesn't prove or disprove Christianity, but it does say that there has been bad things done in the name of Christianity, and I don't think we should whitewash that. And I think that's maybe where Andrew was getting to earlier. But within all of this, there's a really important point that Tom Holland makes in his book about the way that we judge things like violence and slavery. And I think this quote is absolutely fascinating. He's talking about the worst things that Christians have done in history, and then we'll summarize the evidence. So what he goes on to say is that many Christians over the course of this time, the last 2,000 years, have themselves become agents of terror, like the Crusades, for example. They have put the weak in their shadow. They've brought suffering and persecution and slavery in the wake. Yet, and this is critical, the standards by which they stand condemned for this are themselves Christian. Nor, even if churches across the West continue to empty, does it seem likely these standards will quickly change. And he quotes them from the Bible. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And he says, that's something we still believe today. This is the myth that we in the West still persist in clinging to. Christendom, in that sense, remains Christendom still. And his point is, the reason we judge so harshly Christians who did that violence to people or put people in slavery is because we're judging them against a Christian benchmark. So at the root of our criticism of Christians is the Christian standard, and that is quite powerful. So Andrew, I'll just summarize the argument, and then for those of you who've been asleep for half an hour, wake up again, and we can then maybe just think about what all this means for the last sort of 10 minutes or so. So the broad thrust of the argument is, I would argue that yes, of course, Christianity has an impact on the sort of way we live in terms of calendars and stuff like that, but actually on a much deeper level, Christianity does have a significant influence on the way Westerners think and act today. To give two examples of that, and they are two of some more, things like the sanctity of life and morality do seem to have Christian underpinnings, and that's not something that's just exclusively for people who follow Jesus today. That seems to be for everyone in our society. They are benchmarks that we all hold ourselves to, that we all kind of value as being important, that self-sacrifice is a good thing, it's a very honorable thing to do, and so on and so forth. But it's also important to say what the argument doesn't say. So what the argument doesn't say is that Christians are better people in and of themselves than non-Christians. It doesn't say that at all. It doesn't say that Christianity is the only influence on the way we think. You could easily point to all sorts of things, like, say, democracy, that clearly doesn't necessarily come from a Christian worldview. That's definitely something that we seem to inherit from sort of Greek culture. Or that Christianity is true because it influences our thinking. Or lastly, that Christianity has had a brilliant history of exclusively encouraging human progress. The argument is not saying any of those things, and it can't say any of those things. That's impossible for it to say. But what it does say, I think, is that we do need to think carefully about the deep nature in which it affects the way we think and some of the things that we hold on to. Andrew, I'll probably pause there because I've probably talked for sort of 14, 15 minutes on that. And is there anything that didn't make sense or you thought we needed to probe a little further?
I think that's very interesting, and I know you told us at the beginning you're going to ask the question, well, sort of, so what? So I'd quite like you, please, to unpack for us why it matters that here we are sitting in the West, we have got this tradition, whether we're Christians or not, we are in some ways influenced by this tradition. I think you've made that case very well. But should that make any difference to me as an individual? After all, Christadelphians are a Bible-believing group of Christians. We try to do the right thing. We try to preach the gospel and so on. And there's a bit of a risk that there's a sort of academic interest, isn't there, in how we all came about. but surely isn't there something to be said about how it should affect our lives?
Yeah, so I think that's a very fair point. So I guess we're now moving from, I guess, history and culture, which I do hope is interesting. And if you've never thought about this, might be a bit kind of eye-opening and go, okay, yeah. And for some of that, like some of this is new to me. I'd never sort of thought that deeply about why it affects us. But yeah, Andrew's right. The point is, so what? So I think on this, I am going to kind of think a little bit about Jesus. And the reason I'll do this is because what we've basically argued is that the kind of Christian worldview influences things in the way we think today. And the sort of source of that kind of Kelsey is Jesus. And I think there's obviously lots of historical evidence that he lived and that he did various things and he died and so on. So I'm not going to build the case for the sort of historical evidence of Jesus today, but I will just, before we have a look at a few biblical passages and think about what we can understand about Jesus from this, I just wanted to quote this book, which is by a guy who actually studied why sort of certain very conservative religious groups sometimes don't like medicine. And he actually makes a very interesting sort of comment as he's talking about why he wrote this particular book. And he makes this point that actually, historically, you have to be impressed. Most people, when they come to the life of Jesus, are really impressed with him, even if maybe we're not impressed with the lives of people who followed him in his name, if you like the Crusaders. And he says, you have to be impressed with the man described as Jesus of Nazareth. At the time of Jesus' life, child abuse, as noted by one historian, was the crying vice of the Roman Empire, very common. Infanticide, the killing of children, was common. Abandonment was common. Children were property, no different than slaves. Jesus stood up for children, cared about them when those around him typically didn't. And I've used that quote as an illustration to kind of highlight the quite revolutionary nature of Jesus of Nazareth. And perhaps if we live in a Christian worldview, we might miss some of that. And actually, I think what we see is just how transformational Jesus was then in his culture. Let me give you one example. So if you're on your screen or something, you can like have a look at the passage, but I'm conscious that you can always look at them in context. I haven't just sort of picked sort of this odd verse out and just tried to sort of crowbar it into my argument. Take, for example, the principle of violence. We talked a little bit about that earlier, didn't we, about the Crusaders? And I guess the question is was that something that was done in the spirit of Jesus? And actually, what I think you see in the life of Jesus is actually someone who was utterly extraordinary. So I guess the point I'm making at this point is that Jesus was a complete revolutionary in many ways. And in this particular instance, he's near the end of his life, and he is in conversation with people near him who were members of the sort of Jewish elite at the time. And in John chapter 18, it kind of records this dialogue that happens between Jesus and the Roman governor Pilate. And there's a really interesting sort of dialogue where Jesus is talking about the way he views the concept of fighting, I suppose. And he makes the point that that's not something that he does. He answers Pilate and says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not have been delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. And his point here is that it's not in the spirit of him or his followers to fight. He could have taken a violent sort of objection to him being taken and put in this sort of sham trial that he was placed in, and he doesn't. And actually, I think you'd find it very, very challenging all that down through the eras to find many people who've taken this very, very sort of light touch when they're aggressively pushed. Most people fight back. It's almost that human instinct. And Jesus' teaching on this is utterly radical. So I've quoted another passage of the sort of New Testament here, where it gives in one of the sort of most famous sort of teachings of Jesus, sometimes it's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's about the way that Jesus viewed others. Now, under the Jewish law, there is a principle about loving your neighbor. And some of the sort of rabbis had turned that from saying you should love your neighbor to say you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But Jesus kind of completely upends that and says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Now that is tough. So what Jesus was challenging his followers to do was to love his enemies. And we see in the life that he lived, that was the sort of spirit he took on. And that was just extraordinary for the people, I would suggest, who are listening, and extraordinary in the context of other things that had gone before him culturally. But I think this taps into, I guess, where Jesus perceived these principles to come from. And he actually ties the principles around how we should treat one another into the character of God, which is a fairly sort of profound thought. So bear with me as I just sort of sketch the next couple of slides out. And what I hope to kind of illustrate is that when we think about the kind of tentacles of Christianity today, we've got to then think back to the source of them and think, well, where did that come from? And can we put trust in that as to a place to think about our frame for the world, to understand the world and that kind of thing? So just let's carry on with the quote, because Jesus then goes on to say, for he makes his sun, I think that should be the sun, he makes the sun, that's God, rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So the reason as to why Jesus says that his followers should love their enemies is because God provides good things, the sun, every day, and he doesn't just give that to people who follow him, who are good notionally, he gives it to everyone. Equally, he doesn't send rain just on the sort of the good people, just people, but on the unjust. And so Jesus says that the way that humans should live should mirror the spirit and actions of God. And by extension, I suppose, Jesus, through his life, claimed to be showing that to others as well. And he goes on to explain that, well, actually, this is a challenging thing, but actually, really, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? So tax collectors loved each other because they were pals, but they didn't love people they didn't like. And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? He's saying, look, actually, is that really a good thing? If you like people who like you, that's a nice thing to do, but it's not particularly profound. His challenge is a great one. You must be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. So the point I would suggest is that when we think about sort of the source of the Christian worldview, it's Jesus. But it doesn't stop with Jesus. Jesus claims that that's anchored in God himself. And that is a really sort of profound thought, that actually we've gone from thinking about things like the way we might think today about sort of the equality of people. But actually, when we think about where that's come from, there's an extraordinarily big claim. And I guess then we've got to think about whether we can prove and disprove that. And we'll come on to that in a second. So when we think that Jesus' morality is anchored in God himself, we can then start to think about who God is. And this is where the biblical texts are fascinating, because they give us all sorts of insights into the way that God thinks and the way that God acts. And so one of the foundation principles we've thought about today is whether humanity is special. And it's a question for all of us to sort of ponder. And as if we accept that there's a God and that Jesus is related to him and his son and that kind of thing, I think there's evidence for that we'll come on to in a second, then we can start to think about the foundations on which we might build our understanding of the world. And in this instance, you've got here in Genesis 1, this foundational stone about how God views humanity. So it's not about how we view it in that sense. It's about how God created men and women. And it says God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So that is like a morality that's sourced in God, that he believes that humanity is in his image. And that's a foundation stone that we looked at earlier, Tom Holland and others highlight, is actually still fundamental to the way people think today. But you need God to have that foundation to get to this particular point. And it's interesting that in that context, there's then a section where it's clear that God understands these principles of good and evil and chose to give humanity the ability to understand those things. But it's not that God has kind of left humanity trying of wrestling without really knowing about this. God has, in the language of the Christian writers, provided Jesus to help us understand this. So there's a really interesting passage in Hebrews where it talks about how well known humanity is by God. Now, all of this, of course, is predicated on the idea that God and Jesus exist and the Bible is a revelation from God. But we'll come on to think about why that is in a second. But if you accept those principles, these are sort of really interesting insights into the way that this God might exist and think. So it describes here that the word of God, which I think is actually a cipher here for Jesus, but I guess it could also refer to the way that God thinks. It's living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intents of the heart. Point is, God and Jesus understand the human condition. But it goes on to say, actually, because Jesus was a human being like us, he understands the human condition so well. And it goes on to explain that actually Jesus, as a person who's lived a life of humanity, who's understood what it's like, can sympathize with the challenges and the things that we face in our lives. And it goes on at the end to say that because of that, we can, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So what we thought about there is that Jesus roots his morality in God. God understands humanity. He understands that they're in his image. He understands that they have this ability for good and evil, and he understands that. But we're not kind of sat there being terrified of this God, because actually he then sent his son. This is the sort of broad Christian plan, who understands and sympathizes with the way that humans work. Actually, that Jesus is there to help us in our sort of service of God. And that is a very profound thought, that actually if we can get to a place where we can accept that there's evidence for the Christian God and his son Jesus and what this all means, it's not something that should terrify us or scare us to sort of smithereens. It provides us with great comfort that actually we can go into the world knowing where our morality is sourced from, where our understanding that humanity is equal from, and we've got someone who we can follow, who's if you like, walked a mile in our shoes. But that's the sort of broad sweep of Christian history and why morality and these principles of equality that they're rooted in God. Jesus trusted that was the way that God was. But there is this big question: how would you begin to think that you can trust in this? Is it just a vestige of sort of evolutionary history, and that's the way that sort of humanity quite likes these kind of myths that they can believe in? Is there anything objective that we can use to test to see whether we can place our trust in God and Jesus? And actually, and I think this is sometimes a surprise to people who've never come across Christianity before, actually there is a very obvious proof point that's made by one of the earliest Christian writers to say, well, look, you can test this, and if that's not true, you can give up with the whole thing. This whole concept of Jesus and God, you can kind of scrap it, put it in the bin. But if it's proved true, then all of these big building blocks we were just talking to around who God is and who Jesus is and the morality and values they stand for, they are rooted in some objective fact. And this principle is the concept of Jesus being risen from the dead. And it's in a section in this letter that was written sort of 20 years after the life of Jesus, where the writer says in the yellow section, if Christ, Jesus, had not been raised, then our preaching is vain and your faith is in vain. I.e., if you can say that Jesus definitely didn't rise from the dead, don't bother, give up. Your faith's empty, it doesn't mean anything. But if it is true, then the whole foundational worldview of Christianity stands or falls on that. And so I guess my hope that what we've done tonight is to try and broadly sketch out that in the way we think today, there are Christian influences. And that presents some interesting questions that if we've never thought about that before, we need to try and think, well, where do I get my worldview from? Where does that come from? And for Christians, it comes from Jesus. And Jesus says that it actually comes from God himself. That's the sort of source on which all of this sits. And that's why we believe that humanity is special in his image and that we understand good and evil, because God helps us to understand that. And the way I think we can prove it is by testing and seeing whether Jesus rose from the dead. That's the validation proof to try and understand whether that's all true. So I guess my challenge for this evening, for anyone who is thinking about Christianity for the first time, is to think about some of those fundamental questions about why we think the way we do, and also to give this a chance. Like, do test that particular piece of evidence. And if you can prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you can kind of scrap it. But if you start to look into that particular set of events in history and think something weird's going on here, it might be a reason to give the sort of Christian faith a fresh glance. So, Andrew, that is a bit of a summary that hopefully tied up some of the so what questions that you were probing earlier. But go on, anything that we've missed or didn't make sense?
Well, it's raised one. Thank you, John. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I think the way you ended by saying that God has provided evidence that makes it worth not just being part of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, but actually actively embracing it. I found that powerful. But two questions occur to me, and it's 10 to 9, so there's time for others to ask questions, please, but maybe I can begin with a couple of questions, John.
Sure.
My first one is, is Western society, in your view, better as a result of this Judeo-Christian heritage?
Yeah.
And is it somehow better than, I don't know, Burmese or Indian or Chinese or something society? And then I've got a linked question, which is, my reading of history is that in Western society, despite these benefits, the moral compass, we often talk about moral compass, don't we? And it's there. And as you rightly say, Christians and non-Christians alike, by and large, in the Western world, accept the same moral compass. Why is it that numbers of active Christians seem to be dwindling? Is there something happening that's moving away from these rich influences that you've told us about?
Yeah, great questions. I might play the role where I say, I'll give my view, and then I might ask you for yours, Andrew. So firstly, is Western society better than others? I suppose I'll answer that in two ways. The first way is to say, well, has sort of Christendom benefited in ways that other societies haven't? And on some level, the answer is clearly yes. And again, it wouldn't be my view, it would be the sort of purview of historians and economists to sort of highlight this, that actually the pace of growth in Western economies was partly driven because of the nuclear family and all that kind of thing. So I think on one level, the pace of economic growth, if that's a health of whether it's better or not, definitely there was some benefit there. However, I guess the other question, the other part of the answer is, are the humans in those arenas better than others? And I think the answer to that would probably be, well, probably not. I think what you see fairly equally across the world is brilliant examples of wonderful kindness and acts of sort of human brilliance, and equally terrible atrocities as well. And it seems to me that no particular world religion or sect or nationality puts pay to being the sort of perfect religion. I think it highlights that there is a human condition that it is exactly what the Bible would paint, that humanity has this amazing capability for brilliant stuff, but equally seems to have this unnerving ability to go wrong, to do things badly, that we also probably detect in ourselves quite readily. So I would say two things there. Firstly, economically, I think there is an argument to say that it did benefit the Western world. But on a more moral level, I think it'd be very hard pushed to argue that Christianity has sort of benefit, or society's better for it, and that kind of thing. What do you think on that, Andrew? And I'll come on to the second question in a second.
Yeah, I think society's better for it. And one of the interesting things for me, since I left my full-time job 4 years ago, I've been working overseas quite a lot. And it's very interesting that in some countries, at least without the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is simply not the same idea of moral compass or personal duty and so on. I won't say that's true in all other countries, but that's quite interesting. So I think countries that have at some time been influenced by Christianity or Christian traditions have some quite deep-seated things that have made society more equitable.
You mean things like the rule of law, for example, Andrew? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Certainly about rule of law, but sort of caring for individuals and that sort of thing. And I see that more strongly in my experience in Western societies than I do in some others, at least. Of course, I've not visited every country in the world, but I think you're right. I think the other thing I would say is Jesus never said that Christianity was easy or that everyone would accept it. And this is maybe going into what you're going to say next. But so it doesn't surprise me particularly that fewer people see the benefits of Christianity or are prepared to follow Jesus than we would like to see. That's a disappointment, but it's not a surprise.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think on that second question around number of active Christians, I think the number of overall global Christians is probably rising, but that's largely coming from areas like Africa and Asia, interestingly enough. But I guess the question is, why are they depleting in the West? And I think that would be for all sorts of reasons. But I think there are probably a few sort of foundational reasons as to why people are sort of moving further away from faith. I think there's probably certain, there's been a sort of fairly aggressive assault on sort of faith over the last sort of 150, 200 years in particular strands, particularly, I guess, more recently, things like the New Atheist movement and that, where it's been a very aggressive push that religion is almost a bad thing and it needs to be kind of removed from society. So I think that's had an effect. I also think that there is, and I think there's some quite interesting data on this, where you see economic health of a nation rise over time, you actually see that the propensity to faith decline. And there's probably something to be said for that, that actually as you tend to get wealthier in a nation, you maybe don't feel that you need to think about a God, because you can kind of trust in your own ability to deal with something and that kind of thing. So I think the question, it's maybe one for another topic, but I think there's definitely probably lots of different reasons as to why faith is declining. But I think the foundational point you made about Jesus didn't predict that it would be an easy life. It is a hard thing to do to follow Jesus. He makes that point very clear, that you take up your cross and follow him. He's never saying become a Christian and everything will become amazing. It's quite the opposite. In fact, many Christians down through the ages who've lived extraordinary lives of faith have had the most horrific lives because of that. And they really have followed in the spirit of Jesus in that sense. So I think, yeah, there's a combination of Christianity never promises ease. It's quite a challenging faith. It really challenges sort of fundamentals of who you are and how you act. And as Jesus highlights, he challenges us to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's not an easy ride in that sense, although by God's grace, it's something you can do with great comfort. So I think that's probably a few thoughts on that. Anything I've missed there, you think?
I think what you've done is sort of put towards some other things we might want to unpack, but on another occasion. But thank you very much for that. I see it's at least the time where I am is 2 minutes to 9, and so I think we need to wrap up and say, first of all, John, thank you. It's good to see that you have not only done your research in history, but actually then turned the spotlight on ourselves, on yourself, and on all of us. And there is quite a challenge there. So I hope everyone online recognises that, and I do hope you found this useful, because of course our aim is to help anyone who wants to listen to join with us in facing those challenges together, the challenges of following the Master, the Lord Jesus Christ. So thanks for that, John. And I will just wind up by saying, if you want to know more about what we teach and what we preach, or Christadelphians generally, more about what the Bible says, do look on our Facebook page, Watford Christadelphians, and there's quite a lot of materials on there that you can look at, including other talks and so on. So please do that and get in touch with us if you would like to. Secondly, this month, where are we now? We're in October. So next month, in a month's time, we'll be doing, God willing, a similar webinar. And the subject next month, 11th of November, God willing, is what happens after we die. So that sort of goes to the question, is it all worth it?
Yeah.
So we do hope you will join us next month to think about what happens after we die, and we hope we can see you and bring your friends next week. John, is there anything else you wanted to say in conclusion?
No, I think well, yes, yeah. The one thing I would say is we've skated over quite a lot of material there. There's probably lots of things that we haven't covered, particularly around some of the like life in Jesus, what that means, how you would associate yourself with Jesus, loads of things like that. But the purpose of these evenings is never to cover everything in great detail. It's just to kind of sketch out big, broad pictures that we can then hopefully fill in more detail over time.
Well, thank you, John. And I've enjoyed talking to you and listening to you. So I hope everyone who's logged in this evening has enjoyed it too. Here we are, 9 o'clock, time to finish. So it's goodbye from him and it's goodbye from me. Good night.